coal, steel, and rail defined the strategic grammar of Europe before 1939. Industrial districts, Ruhr and Saar in Germany, Nord-Pas-de-Calais and Lorraine in France, the Borinage and Liège-Seraing Basin in Belgium, Upper Silesia and Dombrowa in Poland, Donbas and WWII in the USSR, were not only clusters of shafts and furnaces, but integrated settlements whose housing, food shops, schools, and hospitals were financed or controlled by the mine or mill. Pre-war output figures underscore the stakes. In 1938, Germany produced over 180 million tons of hard coal and around 23 to 24 million tons of pig iron. France produced roughly 47 million tons of coal and about 6 to 7 million tons of pig iron. Poland mined more than 30 million tons of coal, with Upper Silesia contributing a large share. The USSR in 1940 recorded about 165 to 170 million tons of coal and over 18 million tons of pig iron. Railways bound these districts into national war economies. The Deutsche Reichsbahn managed roughly 68,000 kilometers of standard gauge lines. The USSR operated over 100,000 kilometers on broad gauge, France around 41,000 kilometers, Poland near 20,000 kilometers. These networks determined how blast furnaces were charged, how gun barrels and locomotive boilers moved, and how city gas and electricity plants were fed. Between 1936 and 1939, several governments reoriented their industrial policy toward war readiness. Germany's four-year plan emphasized autarky, synthetic fuel, and rubber, and expansion of Reichswerke Hermann Göring to internalize ore-to-steel flows. France accelerated rearmament but faced fiscal and labor constraints. Its northern coal fields remained essential for steel centers at Denain and Longwy. Poland launched the Central Industrial Region to disperse armaments east of the Vistula, while still relying on Silesian coal and rail corridors through Upper Silesia and the Dombrowa Basin. The USSR's second and third five-year plans deepened Donbas coking capacity, expanded Kuzbass as a hedge, and connected new steelworks at Magnitogorsk and Zaporizhstal to inland rail hubs. Company towns in these regions housed concentrated, often unionized, technically skilled workforces. Their output and their labor politics were continuously tracked by military and interior ministries. Strategic thinking on the eve of war treated these districts as objectives comparable to fortresses. German planning identified iron ore from Lorraine, coking coal from northern France and Belgium, and the industrial plant of Upper Silesia and the Polish coal belt as resources that would, if captured, be redirected to the Reich's armament matrix. Intelligence branches compiled maps of shaft depths, coking batteries, and power station loads. Railway officers annotated axle load limits, siding capacities, and choke points at river bridges. French and British staff studies emphasized defensive lines that also screened mines and mills, while blockade plans assumed that denying Germany imported oil and Swedish ore via Narvik would amplify pressure on Ruhr steel. Polish railway officers prepared wartime timetables to keep eastbound military traffic and southbound coal export moving on single-track segments already near saturation. Soviet planners, assessing a possible Western invasion, listed Donbas and Dnipro hydroelectric assets as evacuation priorities, with rolling stock and critical machine tools to be slated for rail transfer beyond the Volga if necessary. Public sentiment in company towns varied with national politics and recent economic shocks. The Great Depression had left Belgian and French coal fields with intermittent strikes and layoffs. Wage stabilization by 1938 did not erase memories of underemployment. In Upper Silesia, the mixed German-Polish linguistic landscape overlapped with rival union and party traditions. In Donbas, rapid migration under the five-year plans produced settlements with high proportions of first-generation industrial workers. Norms were set as much by plant directors and party committees as by municipal councils. These differences shaped how communities would later respond to occupation orders, labor requisitions, and productivity drives. The opening campaigns of 1939 to 1941 transformed industrial geography into an occupation map. Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 captured most of the Polish coal belt. Upper Silesia's German portion remained within the Reich, while adjacent areas were annexed or placed under the general government. The campaigns of May-June 1940 brought Pas-de-Calais, the Belgian basins, and Lorraine under German military administration. Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June 1941 with over 3 million Axis personnel, drove into the USSR's Western Industrial Zone. By the autumn, parts of Donbas, WWII, and the Dnipro Industrial Arc were under German control or near active fronts. Command arrangements differed by region. In France and Belgium, a military commander in Belgium and northern France coordinated with coal mine committees and French management. In annexed Polish territories, German civil rule integrated mines directly into Reich concerns. In occupied Soviet territories, Army economic staffs and the Economic Staff East interfaced with German corporations, Organization Toll, and newly appointed German plant managers. Labor supply and mobility were already constrained by mass mobilization. By mid-1941, the Wehrmacht had several million men under arms, pulling experienced miners and steelworkers from German pits and mills. Similar mobilizations in France, Poland, and the USSR thinned skilled crews. Early occupation decrees sought to freeze workers in place, compelling them to remain at mines, coking plants, and rail depots. As the war lengthened, Berlin centralized labor policy. In March 1942, the General Plenipotentiary for Labor Allocation set quotas for occupied administrations to send workers to the Reich. By 1944, foreign civilian workers in Germany numbered in the millions, alongside prisoners of war assigned to mines, steelworks, and railway repair shops. Company towns thus became nodes where military goals, economic targets, and coercive labor policy converged. Production had to be sustained or increased. Managers, sometimes pre-war directors retained under supervision, sometimes German appointees, were tasked to meet output schedules under new reporting rules. Rail services had to supply coking coal and haul finished steel while also carrying troops and materiel. From multiple perspectives, the preconditions converged on the same operational reality. For occupiers, mines and mills were instruments to feed munition schedules, measured in tons of coke per week, ingots per heat, wagons per axle day. For local managers and engineers, continuity of plant operation depended on spares, lubricants, and electrical grid stability, not on slogans. For workers and their families, ration scales, pay packets, and safety conditions defined daily life more than strategy documents. For resistance groups or underground networks, shafts, rail yards, and power substations were potential targets or sources of intelligence. These parallel understandings would shape how forced labor quotas were enforced, how production targets were calculated, and how company towns functioned under armed supervision once the occupation systems matured. The occupation systems that took shape between September 1939 and late 1941 opened with measures designed to keep coal faces, furnaces, and rail yards operating under new command. Military staffs moved first. In Poland, German Army field commands posted economic officers to seized districts within days of the armistice, assigning mine inspectors, railway engineers, and accounting teams to survey shafts, coking plants, and depots. Annexed territories were folded into German civil structures. The remaining districts were placed under a governorate whose police and fiscal offices issued work rules and ration scales. In the Low Countries and northern France, a military command headquartered in Brussels coordinated with occupation offices in Lille, Liège, and Charleroi to supervise pits and steelworks. In the USSR's Western Industrial Zone, advancing German formations created economic detachments that followed close behind the front line, registering plant inventories, ordering security for switch yards and substations, and identifying personnel capable of restarting equipment. Initial movements focused on 4 tasks: inventory, immobilization, prioritization, and transport. Inventory meant compiling lists of pits by seam, coking batteries by chamber count, steel furnaces by capacity, rolling mills by product range, and power plants by megawatt rating. Immobilization meant preventing skilled workers from dispersing. Orders required miners, furnace crews, engine fitters, and dispatchers to remain in place and to report daily to plant managers or local labor offices. Prioritization established energy and materials, schedules in which coking, coal, power station, coal, and rail fuel moved before household supplies. Steel plate, rails, and armaments products preceded civilian orders. Transport directives assigned railway divisions to earmark locomotives, wagons, and crews for mineral and steel flows, with station masters receiving written instructions on siding use and axle load limits. In mining towns, gendarmerie patrols and plant guards supervised shifts and guarded stores. In rail centers, field railway units secured bridges and marshalling yards and posted schedules that synchronized military and industrial trains. Key players and command structures emerged quickly. Military commands created economic staffs at Army Group, Army, and Corps levels, each with mining, metallurgy, and transport sections. Civil administrations established departments for heavy industry, fuel, and transport that worked through regional offices located near the largest pits and mills. German industrial combines and purchasing agencies arrived with contracts and technical teams. Where pre-war managers were considered indispensable, they were retained under supervision and required to deliver weekly output and labor reports. Company towns thus answered simultaneously to plant directors, occupation labor offices, police, and railway dispatchers. The reporting chain was dense. Mine captains compiled seam-by-seam tonnages and accident logs. Coking plant chiefs reported chamber availability, battery temperatures, and byproduct recovery. Steelworks sent melt counts, ingot tonnages, and rolling schedules. Railway stations filed wagon arrivals and departures, average turnaround times, and locomotive availability. These data flowed upward to regional control posts and, from there, to national economic staffs that compared actuals to target graphs. Early decisions set the tone for the rest of the war. In the French and Belgian basins, mine committees composed of German supervisors, local technical staff, and representatives of owners or administrators standardized safety protocols and wage tables to stabilize crews. In annexed Polish districts, mines were reorganized within German legal frameworks and aligned to armament deliveries. In the general government, production was directed by governorate decrees that linked quotas to coal grades and shaft depth. In occupied Soviet territories, the opening phase was shaped by the battlefront. Many plants had been stripped by retreating Soviet teams of tool sets, transformers, or critical spares. Where equipment remained, occupation orders prioritized rapid restart of shafts feeding local power stations and steel shops still within rail reach. The railway service, facing war damage and bridge constraints, instituted detours and temporary timetables. Light track and destroyed signal cabins forced lower speeds and manual block working, lengthening cycle times. Labor policy in the opening months remained local and incremental. Plant managers issued workbooks and identity cards, listed essential occupations, and introduced shift rotations that stretched beyond pre-war norms. Food rations were tied to labor category, with miners and steelworkers assigned higher calorie scales to maintain productivity. These scales were adjusted as stocks fluctuated. Police enforced curfews and travel limits to keep crews near pits and mills. Wage tables were recalculated to reflect new currencies and price controls. Arrears from the last weeks of fighting were sometimes paid in vouchers, redeemable only at company or municipal shops. Safety inspectors checked timbering, hoists, and gas monitors. Blast furnace and open hearth crews documented refractory wear and lining life to anticipate shutdowns. Where shafts had flooded or ventilation was compromised, restart plans specified pumping rates, fan hours, and methane checks before crews could return underground. From multiple perspectives, the opening phase presented different priorities, even when actors worked in the same street grid. Occupation authorities measured success in weekly curves of coal lifted, coke quenched, heats tapped, and wagons loaded. For them, graphs and timetables were indicators that order had been restored. Local managers and engineers viewed the same weeks as a triage exercise, maintaining compressors, finding lubricants compatible with available stocks, substituting local refractories for imported bricks, and aligning rail slots with furnace rhythm. Workers and their families experienced the transition as a set of immediate constraints: curfews, revised pay packets, ration coupons, and identity checks, balanced against the need to keep wages and food flowing. Railway men and depot crews interpreted orders through axle loads, boiler washout intervals, coal quality for locomotive fireboxes, and the practicalities of passing military trains on single-track segments. Underground networks and resistance groups treated the first months as reconnaissance, mapping guard routines, learning new document formats, and cataloging which sidings carried coke to which furnaces. Comparative figures revealed the scale of the undertaking across regions. In northern France and Belgium, dozens of pits resumed low-rate extraction within weeks under close supervision. In annexed Polish districts, large collieries moved toward steady output as rail corridors were repaired. In the occupied Soviet zone, the proportion of mines capable of immediate restart was smaller, with several pits requiring months of pumping and reconstruction before crews could return. Railway capacity lagged behind industrial needs everywhere. Damaged bridges and commandeered locomotives reduced daily wagon turns, forcing plant managers to adjust charge mixes and lower blast rates to match deliveries. The opening phase, therefore, did not yet reach the later, more centralized quota regime, but it established the frameworks: technical surveys, layered reporting, labor immobilization, transport priority lists, through which forced labor allocations, factory directives, and production targets would be imposed in subsequent months. Occupation policy converted mines, mills, and rail hubs into scheduled instruments subject to quantified objectives. Central economic offices in Berlin issued monthly and quarterly targets expressed in tons of coal raised per pit, coke per battery, heats per open hearth, and wagons per day per marshalling yard. After February 1942, the Armaments Ministry restructured reporting so that plant directors filed standardized sheets linking input coal grades to blast furnace charge mixes and rolling plans, while the Labor Allocation Office, created in March 1942, translated these production graphs into headcounts by skill: hewers, timbermen, coking operators, furnace men, riggers, fitters, boiler makers, and dispatchers. Targets were tiered: a top-line figure for coal and steel deliveries to the Reich, sub-allocations to each occupied coal field or steel basin, and plant-level quotas attached to ration and wage tables. Enforcement relied on police authority over movement and on railway priority codes that guaranteed coal, coke, ore, and billets precedence over other traffic. Local administrations and managers were instructed to prepare plant-specific production programs. Each program mapped monthly tons against known constraints: seam methane levels, hoist horsepower, ventilation capacity, refractory life, and rail axle load limits to the nearest junction. In regions annexed to the Reich, firms were absorbed into German holding structures. In other zones, owners or administrators remained in office under supervision and signed delivery contracts with occupation agencies. Managers drew up maintenance calendars for hoists, compressors, and coking ovens, staggered relines for blast furnaces to avoid simultaneous shutdowns, and fixed crew rotations to stabilize output. Rail planners integrated these programs with locomotive diagrams and wagon circuits. Assigning marshalling yards fixed cycle time targets measured in hours from arrival to departure. Workshops scheduled boiler washouts and wheel turning to meet the train graphs. At border transfer points, regauging or transshipment plans accounted for the interface between broad and standard gauge. Labor planning was the pivot between paper targets and actual output. With skilled workers mobilized or displaced, occupation offices established recruitment, retention, and transfer schemes. Recruitment used workplace registration, compulsory hiring rounds, and, later, quotas to send personnel to Germany. Retention tied ration scales and wage supplements to attendance and output norms. Transfers move fitters, coking foremen, or experienced hewers from lower priority shafts to complexes with higher quotas or superior rail access. By mid-1942, planning templates specified headcount ladders for each objective to raise a mine from 2,000 to 2,500 tons per day. Plans might require an additional number of cutters, support crews, and haulage teams, plus a corresponding number of lampmen and checkweighers. To lift a coking battery from 70 to 80 ovens in service, plans listed the masonry crew hours for patching and the coal moisture tolerances to prevent pushing delays. For steelworks, programs balanced scrap, pig iron, and alloy deliveries with electricity and gas availability, assigning heats per day per furnace and rolling sequences to minimize mill changeovers. Opposite these occupation programs stood the planning of governments in exile, domestic authorities in unoccupied zones, and, in the USSR, State Defense Committee directives for evacuation and replacement. In 1941 to 1942, Soviet planning extracted machine tools, generators, and cadres from threatened plants to the Urals and beyond, while setting emergency coal and steel schedules for Kuzbass, Karaganda, and newly built blast furnaces in the east. Railway ministries compiled special evacuation timetables for factories and rolling stock and revised coal dispatch plans to feed relocated steelworks. Plant directors received directives to adapt charge mixes to eastern ore and coke qualities and to adjust furnace practice accordingly. For territories not annexed to Germany but under occupation, legal governments or committees abroad prepared post-war restitution files and encouraged documentation of plant inventories and labor practices. Underground networks collected data on quotas, shipments, and guard routines to be sent to London, Moscow, or other centers. Propaganda accompanied planning on all sides. Occupation authorities circulated factory wall posters that reduced complex targets to simple graphs of norm completion and linked bonus rations to percentage attainment. Radio bulletins highlighted the reopening of shafts and the tapping of first heats under new management. In company towns in France and Belgium, local newspapers under supervision printed tables of coal raised by pit, urging adherence to shift times and safety rules. In annexed districts, public notices emphasized integration into the larger economic community. In the east, proclamations announced the restart of power stations and tram services to signal normality. Conversely, broadcasts from exile governments emphasized national ownership of industrial assets, instructed workers to keep records of requisitions, and warned against acts that would provoke mass reprisals. Soviet messaging stressed the continuity of production in the interior and depicted evacuated plant teams as units assigned to a front in depth. Miscalculations entered at known friction points. Coal quality varied across seams. Substituting lower-calorie coal into coking, blends lengthened cycle times and reduce coke strength, lowering blast furnace permeability and forcing down win rate. Refractory shortages altered furnace campaign lengths and risked unplanned shutdowns. Rail bottlenecks at river bridges and junctions imposed caps on daily wagon throughput. A plan that assumed 24-hour yard operation could fail if curfews restricted night shifts, or if signal systems remained on manual block. Labor turnover rose with transfers to the Reich or escapes across front lines, eroding the skill base that maintenance and safety relied upon. Attempts to compensate through longer shifts had predictable limits in accident rates and equipment wear. On the Soviet side, assumptions about rail capacity to the Urals or about local coal at new sites sometimes lagged behind reality, requiring serial revisions to furnace practice and power station schedules. Doctrines of industrial control shaped the planning language. Occupation economic staffs adopted a methodology that treated each pit or furnace as a node in a network, prioritizing those with the best output-to-rail ratio. Company towns closest to intact double-track lines and major junctions received higher targets. Remote pits on light branch lines were classed as reserve capacity. Maintenance was triaged, hoists, pumps, and fans received priority spares. Ancillary shops were kept running with salvage parts. Safety was subsumed into throughput calculations, but not ignored. Methane thresholds and ventilation hours were codified in shift orders to prevent closures that would jeopardize quotas altogether. In contrast, Soviet emergency doctrine emphasized redundancy and relocation, accepting temporary losses in the West to preserve cadres and machine tools for the interior, then scaling eastward output by building new coking and steel capacity and rebalancing rail corridors. From multiple viewpoints, planning appeared as different but intersecting spreadsheets. To occupation planners, the central task was to fix a predictable flow of coal, coke, and steel to armament schedules, using labor controls and rail priority to bind towns to targets. To managers in the towns, plans were technical matrices of seam sequences, oven temperatures, furnace slags, and train paths that had to align daily, despite missing spares and fluctuating coal grades. To workers, planning translated into shift charts, ration brackets, and identity checks that regulated movement and pay. To underground networks and external governments, the same plans were maps of vulnerabilities, single points of failure at substations, bridges, or oven gas mains. Document trails of requisitions and shipments useful for future audits or sabotage decisions. The strategic objectives were clear on paper. Their attainment depended on whether these layered plans could be held together as fronts moved and resources thinned. The first confrontations between quantified targets and lived practice appeared in the spring and summer of 1941 as crews, managers, police, and military staffs tested each other's rules. In the French Pas-de-Calais basin, a strike began on 26 May 1941 and spread across shafts at Lens, Liévin, Hénin-Liétard, and Anzin. Participation rose rapidly. Contemporary tallies list around 100,000 miners out by early June. The work stoppage disrupted coking cycles and halted deliveries of power station coal. German occupation authorities and French mine administrators responded with a layered approach. Warnings posted at pit heads, food ration adjustments for non-attendees, and arrests coordinated by German field police and French gendarmerie. By June 9, 1941, mining resumed under tight surveillance. Security files record between 1,000 and 1,500 arrests across the basin. Strike committees were broken up, and several dozen organizers were deported in the first waves. Output for June fell below plan, forcing rail dispatchers to reallocate wagons from smaller pits to batteries with intact staffing. In Belgium, the strike of the 100,000 centered on Liège and the Meuse Valley earlier that month, from 10 to 18 May 1941, drawing roughly 70,000 to 100,000 workers from mines and metalworks. Here, too, rail allocations and furnace schedules were disrupted. The military command in Belgium and northern France negotiated with administrators to restore minimal flows while police detained leaders. After work resumed, occupation offices introduced new attendance verification procedures at pithead lamp rooms and mill gates, and mine carpenters and hoist crews were declared indispensable, exempting them from transfers for the next quarter. The first engagements thus established a pattern in the West. Brief stoppages met by arrests and rations leverage, followed by administrative guarantees for critical skills to stabilize throughput. In annexed Polish districts of Upper Silesia and the Donbas Basin, early confrontations were less visible but equally decisive. Management changes brought German legal frameworks into pits and steelworks, with production tied to delivery contracts written in Reich currency. Work slowdowns and absenteeism appeared in late 1940 and early 1941, particularly on longwall faces with methane problems and in coking plants short of refractories. Plant directors responded by reorganizing shifts and offering small wage premiums for hewers assigned to high gas seams. Police units and factory guards conducted identity checks at shift changes. Travel permits were tightened to prevent movement to rural districts. Rail dispatchers prioritized solid floor wagons for heavy coal and set turnaround targets measured in hours at junctions like Sosnowiec and Katowice. The first year under annexation yielded measurable increases in regularity of deliveries, but maintenance logs show rising breakdown rates for compressors and hoists as spare parts inventories shrank. In the occupied Soviet industrial zone, the earliest confrontations were shaped by combat proximity. When German formations entered Donbas in late 1941, they found a mixed landscape, several shafts flooded by deliberate Soviet abandonment, coking plants with oven doors removed, substations stripped of transformers, and rolling stock sent east. Economic detachments ordered rapid surveys and selected pits for restart based on pumping feasibility and rail reach. The initial restarts occurred at shallower seams and at power station feeders near intact lines. Crews were assembled from those who had remained in place. Engineers and foremen were sometimes retained under supervision to accelerate procedures. Against these efforts, partisan groups in small sabotage cells targeted rail infrastructure rather than deep plant interiors, minor explosive charges under fish plates on single-track segments, arson at timber stores, and theft of signal batteries. Railway security units introduced foot patrols along designated kilometers and established guarded blockhouses at bridgeheads. Throughput in the first winter remained below targets. Coal trains ran in short rakes with guards posted in brake vans. Railway yards were early testing grounds. Military trains, ore rakes, and coal wagons competed for slots on limited track controlled by manual block. In L'Île-de-Livrance, Lens, and Thionville, timetables were rewritten to separate military and mineral traffic by windows of several hours. At Charleroi and Liège, shunting accidents rose as inexperienced crews filled gaps left by mobilized railwaymen. In Silesian hubs like Gliwice and Zabrze, locomotive utilization climbed but boiler washout intervals lengthened, increasing failure risk. In Donbas nodes such as Debaltsev and Ilovaisk, bridge constraints forced detours and shortages of broad-to-standard gauge transfer gear slowed wagon exchanges. First quarter reports for 1942 in all regions record wagons per day below plan and idle furnace hours attributable to delays. Managers and engineers confronted technical engagements at furnace and battery level. In the West, coke quality declined when blends substituted higher ash coal. Blast furnaces reduced wind rate to maintain permeability, lowering daily iron output. Open hearth shops adapted by increasing scrap share where available, but rail delivery of scrap was erratic. In Upper Silesia, one furnace after another came due for reline. Directors staggered campaigns to avoid simultaneous shutdowns, yet refractory shortages pushed several to operate beyond recommended lining life. In Donbas, restarts required drying out ovens and purging gas mains. Missteps caused pushing delays or flare-offs that drew military attention. Each incident triggered tightened reporting. Oven temperature logs copied to district offices, furnace slag analyses collated weekly, rail demurrage fees posted directly to plant accounts to penalize long wagon dwell. Labor was engaged not only through arrests or bonuses, but through classification. Attendance meters and check weighing were linked to ration brackets. Miners missing shifts moved to lower calorie scales, while steady crews kept higher scales aligned with heavy work. In France and Belgium, company kitchens reopened with controlled menus tied to plant output. In annexed districts, wage tables were recalculated quarterly to track with price controls. Arrears were converted into vouchers usable at plant stores. In Donbas towns, where currency regimes changed rapidly, pay often combined cash, meal tickets, and in-kind distributions of coal. Resistance activity adapted to these rules, procuring forged workbooks and ration cards to allow couriers and organizers to move inside plant precincts. For occupation staffs, the first quarter with full records, typically early 1942, provided baselines to judge whether enforcement or incentives were more effective at specific sites. Security forces refined their presence. German field gendarmerie and factory guards concentrated on pitheads, lamp rooms, and pay offices. In the rail domain, Bahnpolizei units patrolled yards and signal cabins, while bridge companies manned fixed posts. In France and Belgium, raids followed strike waves and were targeted at known committee members. In annexed Polish territories, checks were continuous and standardized. In the occupied Soviet zone, security detached from large fronts focused on junctions and depots most vulnerable to sabotage. Arrest figures were modest relative to population, but significant in technical roles. The detention of a handful of hoist electricians, coking foremen, or dispatchers could reduce a plant's effective capacity by a measurable percentage until replacements were trained. By late summer 1941 in the West and winter 1941 to 1942 in the East, the first engagements had produced tangible metrics: coal lifted per face per shift, coke push per battery, heats tapped per furnace, and wagons turned per yard, stabilized above the levels of initial chaos but below central targets. Occupation planners construed this as proof that the framework was working but under-resourced. Plant managers read the same numbers as ceiling effects imposed by spares, coal blends, and rail bottlenecks. Workers saw rules harden into a daily regime of timed shifts and document checks. Underground groups compiled the cycle times of guards and the location of single points of failure. These parallel interpretations would feed the next phase. When production graphs were raised, labor transfers widened, and repression or sabotage scaled accordingly. Escalation followed when central targets were raised in 1942, and labor policy shifted from local immobilization to large-scale transfers. Quotas issued in the spring demanded higher coal lifts per face and increased heats per open hearth. Coking batteries were scheduled to run closer to theoretical maximums with shortened maintenance windows. To supply hands for these graphs, occupation offices received orders to recruit and dispatch workers to the Reich. In France, an exchange scheme announced in June 1942 offered the release of prisoners of war against a ratio of civilian volunteers. Intake proved lower than expected, and on February 16, 1943, a statute introduced compulsory service for specified birth cohorts. By late 1943, roughly 600,000 to 700,000 French civilians were employed in Germany. In Belgium and the Netherlands, registration and call-up lists produced additional contingents. From the general government in Poland, deportations mounted through 1942 to 1943. Cumulative transfers over the war reached well above 1 million persons. From occupied Soviet territories, recruitment and forced requisition produced a civilian workforce in Germany that by late 1944 totaled on the order of 2.5 million Ostarbeiter. Alongside civilians, prisoners of war were assigned to mines, steelworks, and rail depots in large numbers. Their deployment expanded markedly after 1941. Company towns experienced crisis as the transfer machinery intersected with plant routines. Pithead lamp rooms added verification desks for travel orders. Assembly points appeared at freight sidings where columns boarded guarded trains. Plant directors received circulars that recalculated crew norms based on expected departures, substituting prisoners of war or transferred youths into jobs previously held by long-serving miners or fitters. Accident logs show a rise in haulage mishaps and cage stoppages during the first months after mass transfers, associated with inexperienced crews and compressed training cycles. At coking plants, oven-pushing delays increased when masonry crews were sent out, and replacements lacked practice in patching doors and jams. On blast furnaces, campaign lengths shortened as refractory relines were deferred under pressure to maintain weekly tonnages. Railway capacity became a binding constraint. Locomotives allocated to deportation trains reduced availability for mineral traffic, and guarded rakes required longer station dwell times. In French and Belgian hubs, daily wagon turns improved slightly after new yard diagrams were introduced in late 1942, but bridge restrictions and manual block controls kept a ceiling on throughput. In Upper Silesia, double-track main lines carried both ore and coal flows at high density. Boiler washout intervals on a freight classes lengthened, and shops reported increased tube failures. In the occupied Soviet zone, 1942 offensives and counteroffensives repeatedly cut mineral lines, forcing detours and short rakes that delivered irregular supplies to batteries and furnaces. Political tensions rose in parallel. In France, the statutory labor service hardened public debate, while occupation offices emphasized that coal and steel targets underpinned food and fuel deliveries. In Belgium and the Netherlands, municipal administrations handled registration under supervision, asserting that orderly compliance would reduce random raids. In annexed Polish districts, the integration of industrial firms into German legal structures made the distinction between local and Reich management less visible on shop floors. Identity checks and travel permits were standardized, and factory guards expanded. In the occupied Soviet zone, Proclamations framed labor requisition as a path to wages and rations, while security units treated refusals as a matter for police courts. Underground groups adjusted methods, increasing document forgery and exfiltration routes for targeted cohorts, and began to coordinate selective work slowdowns, with railway sabotage against specific bridges and signal huts, rather than broad stoppages that risked large reprisals. International factors compounded the crisis. Shipping constraints on ore and alloy elements affected furnace practice. Deliveries of high-grade Swedish ore varied by season and route, and Atlantic traffic limits reduced access to certain alloying materials. From August 1942, American heavy bombers entered the European theater. British and American raids against industrial targets in occupied zones remained limited in scale in 1942 to 1943, but included plants whose output fed rail and armament schedules, such as automotive works in the Paris region. Local authorities responded with sandbagging, fire-watching rosters, and blackout drills. Plant managers wrote contingency plans to drain quench tanks, isolate gas mains, and clear rolling stock from exposed sidings on alert. The larger transportation campaign would come later, but even isolated hits diverted manpower to repairs and forced shifts in rail diagrams. Security forces expanded to manage the escalated regime. In northern France and Belgium, German field gendarmerie and railway police added companies, coordinated with French and Belgian forces for roundups, and placed fixed posts at major bridges and yards. In annexed Polish territories, police battalions rotated through company towns, with orders to protect key equipment and escort transports. In occupied Soviet territories, security detachments concentrated on junctions like Debaltsev and larger depots, establishing curfews that shorten night shifts and push more work into daylight windows. Arrest numbers remained a small percentage of the workforce but had outsized operational effects when they fell on technical roles. Replacing a hoist electrician or coking foreman often required weeks. Plant accounting registered the escalation as rising input-output ratios rather than narratives. To hit coking targets with lower-calorie coal, plants increased oven times, consuming more electricity and gas per ton of coke. Blast furnaces receiving weaker coke lowered wind and accepted slower iron rates, which in turn reduced hot metal available for open hearth shops and forced rolling mills to alter schedules. Rail demurrage fees increased as wagons waited for guarded crossings or for night curfews to lift. Maintenance backlogs grew, compressor overhauls slipped, fan bearings ran longer, and pump spares were cannibalized across pits. Safety inspectors, still operating within formal thresholds, flagged methane exceedances on longwalls where timbering crews had been thinned. Comparative figures from late 1942 and early 1943 show the consequences. In northern France, basin output recovered from the immediate post-strike period, but remained below central targets. In Belgium, steel shops restored heat counts, yet faced scrap shortages tied to rail flow. In Upper Silesia, deliveries to armaments contracts rose on the main lines, while outlying branch pits lagged for lack of wagons. In the occupied Soviet zone, restarts advanced at selected pits and power stations, but front movements and evacuations kept aggregate output low. Across regions, labor inputs per unit of coal or steel increased as crews lengthened shifts to compensate for turnover. From each vantage point, the crisis was legible but differently framed. Central planners saw shortfalls that justified wider requisition and tighter timetable control. Plant directors confronted a calculus of damage limitation, trading refractory life against weekly targets, or shifting skilled men between shops to prevent line stoppages. Workers faced a compressed choice set defined by compulsory service, ration brackets, and risk of arrest, and developed household strategies around shifts, forage, and movement permits. Railwaymen measured the same moment in axle loads, boiler days left to washout, and the odds of clearing guarded junctions on time. Underground networks collected the data that these systems produced, train numbers, guard rotations, and quota tables, preparing for a next phase in which disruption, retaliation, and production graphs would rise together. The wartime peak arrived in 1943 to 1944, when occupation ministries and plant directors attempted to drive mines, furnaces, and rail hubs to their highest sustained rates while fronts intensified and external pressures multiplied. In Germany, a ministerial reorganization in February 1942 had already concentrated armament decisions. By 1943, this structure linked weekly coal and steel graphs to munition schedules with fewer intermediate approvals. In occupied western basins, monthly pit targets were raised again, and steelworks were ordered to increase heats per furnace by compressing repair intervals. In annexed Polish districts, integrated accounting treated Upper Silesian deliveries as part of the Reich's steel balance, while branch pits received instructions to switch to seams with lower gas to maintain face lengths under constrained ventilation. In the occupied Soviet industrial zone, selected Donbas pits and power stations restarted under close supervision where front lines allowed, with production orders tied directly to local railway capacity and transformer availability. At the furnace and battery level, the peak took a specific technical form. Coke ovens increased coking times to stabilize CSR, coke strength after reaction, when coal blends were weaker. Pushing schedules were synchronized with rail slots to minimize oven idle. Blast furnaces operated with tighter wind and burden controls. Direct reduced ore experiments remained limited by gas quality and refractory life. Open hearth shops shifted charge mixes based on scrap availability, scheduling heats to align with electricity peaks and byproduct gas from coking. Rolling mills optimized campaigns to reduce roll changes. Rail sections and plate were grouped to minimize downtime, and reheating furnaces were held near constant to avoid thermal cycling damage. Maintenance calendars were rewritten so that hoist overhauls, pump rebuilds, and fan bearing replacements occurred in rolling fashion, avoiding simultaneous stoppages across a complex. Each plant sent daily telegraphs of oven availability, furnace wind, slag basicity, heats tapped, mill throughput, and wagon dwell to district offices, which compiled them into comparative tables circulated along the chain. Labor at peak was a layered composition: veteran miners and furnace men, foreign civilian workers under compulsory service, and prisoners of war assigned by camp command. Training manuals were condensed into shift briefings. Practical exams for caging, signaling, and gas detection were administered at accelerated pace. Accident committees recorded changes in incident types: haulage mishaps with inexperienced coupling crews, gas exceedances where timbering lagged, and hand injuries in mills where roll changes were rushed. Ration scales adjusted again, with heavy labor categories retained at higher caloric brackets. Contingent on attendance verified by lamproom and gate records. Pay remained a mix of wages, plant store vouchers, and in-kind allotments, converted into local currencies by posted tables. Rail networks were the decisive field of the peak. In early 1943, timetables in France and Belgium designated windows for mineral traffic separated from troop movements. Yardmasters at L'Île-de-Livrance, Laon, Liège, and Thionville received cycle time targets measured in hours from arrival to remarshalling. In Silesian hubs such as Gliwice and Zabrze, locomotive diagrams increased utilization of freight classes, with boiler washout intervals extended by special authorizations. In the east, broad gauge segments under German control were connected by standard gauge links through transfer yards equipped with cranes and chute-chutes. Each transfer point reported wagons handled per 24 hours and average handlings per wagon. Throughout 1943, these measures raised the ton kilometers, but also created visible points of failure. Air operations and organized sabotage shifted conditions in 1943 to 1944. The attack on dams in May 1943 forced temporary adjustments in Ruhr, Canal, and power management, requiring redispatch of coal and steel by rail while reservoirs were repaired. From late 1943, bombing increasingly targeted marshalling yards, repair shops, and main junctions. In the spring of 1944, a transportation-focused program concentrated on bridges, signal boxes, and locomotive depots in France and Belgium in the months before amphibious operations in the West. Yard photographs after raids show blocked tracks, cratered throats, and immobilized wagons. Railway administrations responded with night-and-day clearance crews, emergency crossovers, and temporary block posts. Plant managers rewrote receiving schedules and increased on-site stockpiles where space allowed. Meanwhile, underground networks intensified selective cuts, charges under fish plates on single-track segments, removed bolts on joint bars at curves, and arson at timber stores. Security commands increased patrol density per kilometer and introduced escorted trains with guards posted in brake vans. On the Eastern Front, front movements in 1943 to 1944 altered the industrial map. After summer operations in 1943, German units held parts of Donbas but faced proximity to combat. Evacuation plans by Soviet teams had earlier removed machine tools and personnel from key shops, limiting restart capacity. In the second half of 1943 and into 1944, Soviet offensives recaptured many industrial sites. Retreat instructions on the German side included demolition of substations, bridges, and selected plant components. Soviet restoration brigades followed with pumping schedules for flooded shafts, temporary substations, and emergency rail repair units. Company towns changed hands with inventories shifted or destroyed, requiring repeated recalculation of production graphs based on what remained and what the rail lines could carry. Quantitatively, the peak displayed contrasting curves. In the Reich and annexed districts, raw steel output in 1943 reached high annual totals before declining in 1944 as transport damage accumulated and fuel quality fell. Coal production in the Ruhr remained large in absolute terms, but increasingly irregular in delivery to consumers. In northern France and Belgium, monthly coal extractions rose through late 1943, followed by uneven outputs in 1944 as rail disruptions intensified. In the occupied Soviet zone under German control, industrial output remained a fraction of pre-war baselines even at peak, constrained by evacuation, damage, and frontline distance. After recapture, Soviet emergency production in the east, scaled while restoration in the west, proceeded in phases. These curves translated into plant-level metrics: more heats per day when rail connections held, then idle furnaces waiting for coke, full battery operation followed by oven damage when coal moisture rose and pushing cycles slipped. Decision-making at the top adapted to these patterns. Central staffs increased cross-substitution. When coke deliveries fell, priority lists shifted hot metal to armor plate mills over civilian orders. When rolling stock was scarce, wagon pools were reallocated among districts with instructions to strip low-priority sidings. Shortages of refractories triggered directives to extend furnace campaigns with stricter slag control. Oxygen enrichment trials were expanded where equipment existed to maintain wind at lower coke rates. Railway ministries issued decrees on locomotive speed limits, mandatory boiler washouts, and axle load adjustments on repaired bridges. Demurrage penalties were raised to push wagons through craters and temporary detours. Security orders emphasized protection of signal cabins, telegraph lines, and bridge approaches over general patrols, concentrating resources on nodes whose loss stalled whole corridors. Civilian life in company towns absorbed the peak as a sequence of schedules and alarms. Shifts began earlier to compensate for curfews. Blackout protocols interrupted oven pushes and furnace taps on raid warnings. Evacuation drills moved families to shelters beside pits and mills. Municipal services rationed water and electricity by neighborhood, while plants kept power to compressors, fans, and mill drives. Schools, hospitals, and canteens functioned with supply chains tied to plant performance. When rail cuts reduced deliveries, menus shifted, and clinics reported shortages of dressings and fuel. Household strategies combined legal rations, workplace kitchens, and informal exchanges of coal slack or scrap. Document checks at pitheads and yard gates became more frequent, and identity cards accumulated stamps and annotations recording attendance and exemptions. From divergent perspectives, the peak reached in 1943 to 1944 was not a single crest, but a series of plateaus separated by shocks. Occupation planners read weekly returns as proof that coercive labor allocations, compressed maintenance and rail priority codes could sustain deliveries despite external attacks. Plant directors saw a narrowing margin of safety in refractory wear, hoist reliability, and fan hours, with each missed delivery multiplying later risks. Workers measured the same period in shift length, ration stability, and the probability of inspection or roundup. Railwaymen counted boiler days to the next washout, wagons cleared per hour after a raid, and bridge tonnage limits after temporary repairs. Underground groups and external commands interpreted the growing sensitivity of the system to nodal disruption as confirmation that targeted blows at yards, bridges, and substations would convert high graphs into idle equipment. The peak thus contained within it the conditions for the subsequent turning point, when cumulative transport damage and frontline reversals forced a structural change in output, labor control, and the very map of company towns under arms. Adaptation unfolded on multiple layers as company towns navigated between coercive targets and degrading infrastructure. Occupation administrations revised protection and routing doctrine to keep coal, steel, and rail graphs from collapsing. Security units shifted from broad patrols to a node defense model. Bridges, signal cabins, and substation yards received fixed posts, while roving teams inspected fish plates and telegraph lines at set kilometer intervals. Railway engineers introduced sectional timetables that cut networks into smaller operating zones. Trains advanced by district, with handover rules that limited cascading delays when a junction was hit. Yardmasters reorganized ladder tracks to isolate arrival, classification, and departure functions, reducing the chance that a single crater immobilized all movement. Plants reoriented internal logistics, placing buffer stockpiles of screened coal near batteries and creating on-site loops so locomotives could turn without entering public yards. Technical workarounds multiplied. Collieries installed or expanded washers to raise calorific value of mixed seams. Briquetting plants used fines to supplement fuel for boilers and domestic distribution. Coking engineers adjusted blends to preserve CSR, accepting longer coking times and more gas consumption per ton. Furnace men tightened burden control and slag basicity to extend campaigns under refractory shortages. Oxygen enrichment trials were widened, where compressors allowed, maintaining wind at reduced coke rates. Open hearth managers altered charge sequences to compensate for irregular scrap deliveries, scheduling heats to coincide with peaks in byproduct gas and grid power. Rolling mills grouped campaigns to limit roll changes and relined reheating furnaces in sections to keep some capacity live during repairs. Workshops standardized substitution lists for bearings, belts, and seals, reducing downtime when exact parts were unavailable. Labor systems adapted under pressure. Training shifted to accelerated modules at pithead schools and mill shops, where instruction focused on caging signals, gas detection, and emergency hoist procedures. Gate registers and lamp room records were integrated into payroll and ration tables to stabilize attendance. Mixed crews combined veteran miners or furnace men with transferred workers or prisoners of war, with foremen assigned specifically to critical paths. Hoists, fans, push machines, tapping teams, and coupling crews in yards. Accident committees identified repeat failure modes and issued brief bulletins that were read at the start of each shift. Municipal authorities coordinated canteen menus with plant output to reinforce heavy labor rations, and workshops introduced simple protective equipment standards to limit injuries that threatened throughput. Resistance too professionalized. Underground networks in France and Belgium transitioned from sporadic strikes to targeted disruption plans. Railway sabotage favored the low-explosive, high-delay method. Charges placed under fish plates on curves, removed bolts at joint bars after the last scheduled patrol, and timed cuts in signal wiring that forced manual block and slowed rakes without permanent damage. In mining districts, selective actions focused on outer rings of plant function. Timber store fires, theft of detonators to interrupt blasting schedules, and disabling of air compressors by contaminating oil systems, rather than internal destruction that risked flooding or fatal accidents. Information flows became as important as explosives. Timetable copies, guard rotation notes, and wagon counts were collated and transmitted to external commands. In annexed districts, clandestine networks combine document forgery with courier lines to move targeted workers away from columns and to replace arrested specialists with trained substitutes. On the Soviet side, adaptation centered on reconstruction crews and east-west balancing. As towns were recaptured, restoration brigades pumped flooded shafts according to staged schedules, replaced transformers with mobile units, and built temporary trestles to reopen lines. Emergency steel shops in the interior adjusted charge mixes to local ores and coals, while returning teams documented remaining equipment in the west and prioritized restart of power stations and mines that fed them. Rail ministries synchronized rolling stock allocation to evacuation and return phases, pairing eastbound loads of machine tools and cadres with westbound deliveries of rails, poles, and transformers. In practice, the balance was dynamic. Frontline proximity limited sustained output in recaptured basins, but power and rail served as multipliers when local conditions allowed. Occupation administrations responded to resistance with countermeasures designed to preserve throughput while managing reprisals within political constraints. Railway police introduced escorted trains with guards and brake vans, spot-lit bridge approaches at night, and required double checks on fish plates at designated curves. Yard diagrams added protected refugee tracks for critical wagons, and repair teams were pre-positioned with rail, fish plates, and spikes loaded on handcars. In plants, gas mains and oven valves received padlocks and seals. Access to lamp rooms and detonator stores was fenced and guarded, and pay offices placed glass screens and counting machines to shorten queues and reduce opportunities for document forgery detection to escalate into stoppages. Where arrests removed key technicians, plant directors petitioned for temporary exemptions or transfers to avoid cascading shutdowns. Innovation also took administrative forms. Central staffs deployed comparative tables that ranked pits, batteries, and furnaces by output to constraint ratio. Sites that achieved higher wagon turns or lower accident rates under similar conditions were designated pattern plants. Their maintenance calendars and shift structures were circulated as templates. Conversely, weak performers were assigned visiting teams of engineers and security officers to audit hoists, fans, schedules, and gate procedures. Railway ministries introduced demurrage penalties tied to district averages rather than absolute times to account for raid damage. This preserved incentives without punishing nodes hit hardest by external shocks. Insurance pools inside occupation economies compensated firms for equipment losses if they adopted prescribed safeguards, encouraging standardization of firewalls, sand bunkers, and valve isolation plans. Psychological adaptation manifested as routinization. For workers, the calendar was defined by shift bells, ration collection, identity inspections, and occasional alerts. For managers, daily telegraphs reduced uncertainty to columns: wagons in, coke pushed, heats tapped, accidents recorded. For railwaymen, the metric was boiler days to washout, axle loads on repaired spans, and crossing slots cleared per hour under blackout. For security units, performance was kilometers patrolled without incident, and the ratio of escorted trains to attempts at sabotage. Underground networks measured time in courier legs, and the survival of document sets through checks. The toll remained visible in absenteeism spikes after raids, turnover as columns departed, and accident clusters following crew reshuffles. Comparative dynamics are clear when set side by side. In western basins, resistance increasingly targeted rail nodes in 1944, leveraging the transportation campaign to multiply effects. Occupation adaptation centered on faster clearance and sectionalized operations. In annexed Polish districts, where integration into Reich structures was tighter, adaptation skewed toward industrial substitution and rigorous gate control, while resistance prioritized information and selective interference that avoided catastrophic plant damage. In the occupied Soviet zone, resistance and front movements limited the duration of occupation control. Adaptation there focused on quick restarts and evacuation discipline rather than deep re-engineering. Across regions, the same design principles appeared in different proportions: dispersal of risk at yards, buffered stocks at plants, substitution in processes, and intensified training to stabilize mixed crews. By late 1944, the system's capacity to adapt met external limits. Sectional timetables could not compensate for missing bridges. Oxygen enrichment sustained wind only where compressors and power held. Comparative tables could not replace refractory bricks that had no substitute. Yet the repertoire developed node defense, sectional operation, technical substitution, accelerated training, and targeted disruption defined how company towns, under arms and schedules, tried to control outcomes within narrowing margins. What followed would depend less on ingenuity and more on the strategic turn of fronts and the cumulative erosion of transport, power, and the workforce that held the regime together. Momentum shifted in 1944, as rail corridors that had sustained occupation industry were broken systematically while fronts advanced on both edges of Europe. In the West, a transportation-centered air campaign in the spring severed junctions around Paris, Lille, and Liège in the months before June 6, 1944. Yard throats at Trappes, Aulnoy, and La Chapelle were cratered, signal boxes destroyed, and repair depots hit, reducing line capacity despite emergency crossovers and night clearance. In the East, the summer offensive that opened on June 22, 1944, Operation Bagration, shattered Army Group Center and pushed the front hundreds of kilometers west, forcing German field rail units to abandon or demolish broad-gauge links and transformer stations that had connected selected Donbas restarts to standard-gauge corridors. Company towns that had been run by schedule and quota now faced a structural break. Coal moved in short rakes along detours, if at all. Coke ovens sat hot but undercharged. Blast furnaces idled waiting for ore or gas. Locomotive fleets were trapped behind collapsed bridges. Retreat doctrine translated strategy into plant floors. In northern France and Belgium, as Allied ground forces advanced in August-September 1944, occupation commands issued demolition orders for bridges, culverts, and railway power rooms. Lists also named coking gas mains, substation switchgear, and selected hoists for destruction or removal. Administrations instructed plant directors to dispatch removable machine tools and drawings east when wagons could be found. Failing that, to drain quench towers and secure ovens against uncontrolled fires. In annexed districts further east, preparations were staged. Inventories of spare motors and bearings were prioritized for shipment. Archives were boxed. Skilled personnel were earmarked for transfer. In the occupied Soviet zone already retaken in phases, Stalino, Donetsk in early September 1943, Dnipropetrovsk on 25 October 1943, and Kryvyi Rih on 22 February 1944, Soviet restoration brigades expanded, installing temporary substations, pumping flooded shafts, and relaying track toward power stations and steel shops. The turning point thus differed by region. In the west, an abrupt collapse of rail flow under air pressure and ground advances. In the east, a rolling handover with layered damage from both evacuations and retreat demolitions. Labor control inverted as well. Earlier recruitment and transfer drives gave way to withdrawals. Columns formed at pit heads and mill gates for evacuation or forced transport. Others dispersed when orders failed to arrive. Prisoners of war were marched or entrained to new camps. Foreign civilian workers were assembled for movement toward Germany. Local workers weighed the risk of joining columns against staying in place under uncertain authority. Municipal ration offices ceased regular distribution as rail deliveries fell. Plant kitchens ran down stocks within days. Where German units still held junctions, guarded trains departed with mixed loads of tools, personnel, and archives. Where bridges had gone, departures took the form of road convoys under fuel constraints. In recaptured zones, Soviet directives reclassified industrial personnel, calling former crews to report for restoration work with pay tables and rations aligned to emergency norms. Managers who had remained were screened and assigned to restart tasks under new supervision. Quantitative indicators recorded the break. In the West, wagon dwell times in major yards ceased to be meaningful when yards themselves were out of service. Locomotive availability fell as shops lost power or spare tubes. Coal extractions in Pas-de-Calais in July-August 1944 dropped sharply against spring schedules before halting with the front's approach. In Belgium, mills around Liège that had restored heat counts in late 1943 saw rolling campaigns interrupted repeatedly in summer 1944 as rail and power failed, then stopped entirely during the first week of September as Allied units entered the Meuse Valley. In annexed Upper Silesia, figures held into late 1944 under tight rail priority and local power, but input coal grades deteriorated and maintenance arrears accumulated. In the east, aggregate output in areas under German control remained a fraction of pre-war baselines. Once retaken, Soviet emergency production rose at interior sites, while Western restoration moved plant by plant as pumping, power, and rail returned. For railway services, the turning point was encoded in track charts. Before spring 1944, timetables in France and Belgium had preserved windows for mineral traffic. Afterward, dispatchers worked from ad hoc sheets that skipped destroyed sections and used temporary block posts. Axle load limits on hastily repaired bridges cut train weight. Escorted trains with guards and brake vans could not compensate for missing signal interlockings. In Poland and Silesia, freight classes ran at reduced speeds to husband boiler life and to respect repaired bridge limits. Washout intervals already stretched by 1943 to 1944 were extended again by waiver, increasing tube failures. On the eastern axis, the conversion of captured broad gauge to standard gauge, previously a driver of throughput, reversed as German field rail units lifted panels ahead of retreat, while Soviet rail brigades relayed broad gauge behind the front. Plant-level practice reflected the same hinge. Coke ovens, already operating at longer coking times to stabilize strength, lost regular coal deliveries, and were banked or shut. Blast furnaces were blown down or left on minimum wind to avoid thermal shock, accepting hot metal losses but preserving shell integrity where relines were impossible. Open hearth shops that had relied on synchronized electricity peaks and byproduct gas lost that coordination. Heats were canceled or shifted to scrap-heavy charges where power allowed. Rolling mills that had optimized campaigns for rail or plate lost work in progress when reheating furnaces went cold during alerts or power cuts. Changeover plans became moot in the absence of feed. Maintenance staffs, already managing with cannibalized spares, now turned to preservation, greasing idle bearings, draining systems, and tagging equipment for later recommissioning or removal. The security map changed from regular patrols to holding actions. Factory guards and police, once concentrated at lamp rooms, pay offices, and yard throats, redeployed to bridgeheads and road junctions, or were withdrawn with columns. Underground groups expanded operations against the collapsing network, where yards were already inoperable from raids. Teams cut telegraph lines or burned timber stacks to delay repairs. Where columns formed for evacuation, guides led workers to avoid roundup points. Where demolition lists were known, efforts focused on isolating substations or gas mains to limit fires. In recaptured eastern towns, NKPS rail brigades and KVD security detachments arrived with restoration orders. Guards were posted at substations and bridges, while work gangs laid temporary track and strung new lines. Decision centers adapted by triage. In the West, occupation ministries prioritized stripping removable assets from plants unlikely to be held: drawings, special tools, and alloy stocks. In Silesia and the Reich, coal and steel allocations shifted to armament plants closer to intact rail and power, and wagon pools were recalled from occupied zones where retrieval was still feasible. In the USSR, State Defense Committee and People's Commissariat for Railways directives assigned restoration sequences by node: power station first, then pit dewatering, then coking, then furnace restart, with each step tied to a rail repair milestone. Schedules included pumping rates in cubic meters per hour, fan hours for ventilation, and the sequence for energizing switchgear to avoid overloading temporary transformers. From each vantage point, the break was evident but differently described. Occupation planners saw graphs that no longer converged despite additional labor measures. pointing to transport failure and territorial contraction as the binding constraints. Plant directors recorded shutdown sequences and preservation steps instead of output tables. Workers experienced the change as canceled shifts, column assembly orders, or sudden absence of guards. Railwaymen measured it in train orders that no longer matched track reality, boiler days lost to lack of washout facilities, and bridge postings that shifted from axle counts to demolition watches. Underground groups read the same moment as the opening to convert months of reconnaissance into blocking actions that multiplied the effect of lost junctions. In recaptured towns, restoration teams interpreted the turning point as a handover, from operating under quota to rebuilding under emergency doctrine, with company towns reconceived as work sites on a reconstruction front, rather than quota nodes inside an occupation economy. Combat operations and occupation control receded in phases between late 1944 and mid-1945, leaving company towns to manage shutdowns, evacuations, and quick conversions to emergency routines. In northern France and Belgium, rail hubs and coal basins changed hands across August-September 1944. Administration shifted from German military and police staffs to Allied military government and returning national authorities. Factories and yards reopened under guard for clearance and repair. In annexed Polish districts, front movements in January to March 1945 ended German civil rule. Towns in Upper Silesia passed to advancing formations of the First Ukrainian Front. In the east, Donbas and the Dnipro Arc had already been retaken in 1943 to 1944. By spring 1945, reconstruction offices rather than occupation economic staffs defined schedules. The withdrawal phase retained technical logic, lists of what to move, what to render inoperable, and how to preserve equipment for a possible return, were executed to the extent that transport and time allowed. Evacuation and demolition orders translated to specific plant operations. Coking ovens were banked or shut, gas mains isolated and in places vented or blown. Blast furnaces were blown down to prevent shell damage, or left on minimum wind until power failed. Hoists were locked and pumps stopped, which flooded deeper levels within days or weeks depending on geology. Railways lifted panels from lines near bridges slated for demolition, removed signal interlockings, and burned or towed rolling stock when movement east was impossible. In some towns, machine tools, drawings, spares, and alloy stocks left in guarded trains. In others, columns departed by road, leaving workshops to preservation teams who greased bearings, tagged motors, and stacked usable timber and rails for later. The practical result, visible in maintenance and police logs, was a patchwork. Some complexes carefully preserved, others stripped, many damaged at substations and bridges that governed any future restart. Immediate civilian consequences followed from these technical choices. Ration distribution, already tied to plant output, became irregular or ceased as rail deliveries collapsed. Plant kitchens ran on remaining stocks. Municipal water and power networks operated intermittently as compressors, pumps, and generators failed for lack of fuel or parts. With guards redeployed or withdrawn, workers and their families faced a choice set shaped by rumor and proximity to front lines. Join columns, shelter in place, or move to nearby villages. Foreign civilian workers and prisoners of war were marched or entrained toward Germany where possible. In the West, Allied advances overtook some columns and redirected them to holding centers. In the East, retreating formations moved groups back through Silesia toward the Oder. As fronts crossed company towns, artillery and small arms fire added collateral damage to coke stacks. Rail ladders and housing blocks clustered near yards and mills. The end of occupation introduced legal and administrative transitions without restoring immediate normality. In France and Belgium, Allied military authorities and provisional governments secured yards, bridges, and plant precincts. Police and gendarmes took over gate control. Strikes gave way to clearance and repair work under emergency wage tables. Investigations opened into collaboration, requisitions, and labor transfers. Managers and foremen were screened, some suspended or tried, while others were retained to accelerate technical restart under state supervision. Trade unions reconstituted committees in pits and mills, negotiating safety and wage frameworks for dewatering, oven relining, and furnace repair. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, decrees moved key mines, steelworks, and railways toward state ownership, integrating emergency repair programs into national plans. In recaptured Soviet territories, restoration brigades and commissariats assigned cadres by specialty. Returning Ostarbeiter and former POWs passed through filtration procedures before reassignment to industrial work or to other sectors. Railways framed the aftermath in their own metrics: bridge spans by tonnage class repaired per month, kilometers of track restored, locomotives passed feet after boiler washouts and tube replacements, wagon stocks returned to service after wheel turning and bearing packing. Yardmasters received new diagrams that reflected missing ladders and temporary crossovers. Sectional timetables became the basis for gradually relinking districts. In France and Belgium, by late 1944, the priority was clearing wreckage and reopening corridors to ports and urban centers. Mineral flows resumed slowly, with coal from local pits, supplemented by imports as soon as harbor and canal capacity returned. In Silesia and adjacent regions, early 1945 repairs concentrated on bridges and power to allow pumping, followed by coking and then hot metal. The schedule was constrained by labor availability, winter conditions, and the state of power grids. In Donbas, stage pumping and power restoration in 1943 to 1944 had produced scattered restarts. The 1945 task was to integrate these islands into a continuous network. Safety and public health issues emerged as direct sequels to wartime operation. Flooded workings released gases, inadequate ventilation, and rush timbering during dewatering raised accident rates. In steelworks, damaged refractories and improvised relines increased the risk of breakout or wall failure during early heats. Rail yards operating with temporary signaling and manual block reported high shunting accident rates. Housing shortages followed the destruction of blocks built next to pits and mills. Repairs prioritized roofs and windows to house returning workers. Clinics documented malnutrition indicators among heavy laborers during the transition months. Canteens reopened with emergency menus aligned to caloric needs of mining and mill shifts. Schools near plant precincts resumed in limited fashion as power and heating allowed. Human movement, departures, and returns defined the social aftermath. In the West, Allied forces and relief agencies organized displaced persons into camps and transit centers. Registration counted foreign workers, POWs, and civilians from multiple countries. Repatriation proceeded by rail when lines reopened. In the interim, local authorities absorbed those who chose to stay, assigning temporary housing and work. In the East, Soviet authorities organized transfers back to interior sites or to local reconstruction jobs. Screening procedures sorted individuals into categories with differing rights to rations, housing, and work. Families separated by deportation or evacuation navigated municipal lists, Red Cross records, or local committees to locate relatives. Company towns thus operated as nodes in humanitarian logistics as well as industrial recovery. Quantitatively, early post-liberation outputs reflected constraints more than ambition. In northern France and Belgium, coal tonnages in late 1944 and early 1945 rose from zero to fractions of pre-war monthly averages, gated by pumping, power, and rail repair. Steel shops advanced from cold to limited heats as coke returned. In Silesia, in the first half of 1945, mine dewatering and rail reopening permitted incremental shipments, while several furnaces remained banked pending refractory deliveries and power stabilization. In Donbas, output increased across 1944 to 1945 under emergency schedules, but remained below 1940 baselines, with steady gains in pits closest to power stations and intact double-track lines. Across regions, labor productivity initially fell due to mixed crews, training needs, and safety margins, then improved as routines stabilized and spare parts arrived. Security patterns also inverted but persisted. In the West, Allied military police and national forces guarded bridges, yards, and depots against theft and residual sabotage, Curfews remained in selected zones to regulate movement and facilitate night repairs. In recaptured eastern regions, NKVD detachments secured substations and bridges, while rail guards patrolled vulnerable kilometers and escorted trains carrying strategic materials. Factory guards and municipal police returned to gate duty with new insignia and mandates. Identity checks shifted from occupation papers to provisional documents and work permits. The continuity lay in the nodal logic. Protection concentrated on points whose loss would stall dewatering, coking, or rail throughput. From each vantage point, withdrawal and aftermath took measurable forms without immediate moral or political closure. Former occupation planners recorded equipment preserved or lost, and the tonnages that could still be moved before final collapse. Plant directors compiled preservation and restart lists, accident logs, and requests for spares. Workers experienced the end of occupation as a sequence of canceled shifts, evacuations, screenings, and reassignments, punctuated by the reopening of canteens and pay offices. Railwaymen counted repaired spans, locomotive days until the next washout, and wagons returned to service. Reconstruction authorities, Allied, National, or Soviet, translated these local ledgers into regional schedules that would set the terms for the longer post-war settlement of property, management, and output in the company towns that had been run at gunpoint. The long-term effects of wartime occupation in company towns appeared first in property, management, and planning regimes. In France, coal mines were consolidated under Charbonnage de France in 1946, and major steelworks entered state guidance via the Monnet Plan. Belgium retained private ownership, but subjected pits and mills to rationalization programs tied to reconstruction credits. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, decrees in 1945 transferred mines, steelworks, and railways to state ownership. Upper Silesian complexes were integrated into Polish plans alongside population transfers that changed the composition of the workforce. In the Soviet Union, the Fourth Five-Year Plan, 1946 to 1950, set output targets for Donbas and the Dnipro industrial arc, linking restoration of pits and mills to power and rail reconstruction. In Germany, Allied controls on the Ruhr included dismantling and reparations in 1945 to 1947, the International Authority for the Ruhr in 1949, and, from 1952, integration into the European coal and steel community, with France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, and the Netherlands. These frameworks converted emergency schedules into peacetime programs that still measured performance in tons, heats, and wagon turns. Railways encoded the legacy in timetables and bridges. UNRWA consignments and national budgets financed the replacement of destroyed spans and signal systems. By the late 1940s, trunk corridors in France and Belgium restored double track and automatic block on critical sections. In Poland and the USSR, broad gauge and standard gauge interfaces were rebuilt and extended. Donbas lines received heavier rail and upgraded substations to serve new coking and steel capacity. The lesson of nodal vulnerability carried into post-war practice. Yards were redesigned with independent ladders, substations were compartmentalized by firewalls, and bridge protection standards were raised with tonnage class targets. Railway ministries kept sectional timetable concepts and established permanent emergency repair brigades with stockpiles of rail, fish plates, and transformers. Labor institutions reorganized around the experience of coercion and evacuation. Nationalization in France, coupled with industry-wide bargaining, produced wage tables and safety codes that formalized heavy labor rations into canteen standards and set methane thresholds, ventilation hours, and hoist inspection intervals in law. Belgium adopted productivity agreements that tied investment to training in mechanized faces and continuous casting. Poland and Czechoslovakia built technical schools in mining and metallurgy to replenish cadres after wartime losses and transfers. The USSR expanded mining institutes and restoration brigades into permanent ministries with design bureaus for fans, pumps, and hoists. Across regions, accident reporting shifted from plant ledgers to standardized state forms. Black lung and silicosis monitoring widened, and compensation schemes were codified with differing generosity depending on national budgets and political priorities. Industrial prosecutions and reparations formed another layer. In the American military tribunals at Nuremberg, cases against industrial leaders examined plant-level labor allocations, procurement, and production graphs. Sentences varied, and several executives returned to industry after early release under changing Allied policy. Dismantled equipment from Germany moved to receiving states, while claims by France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the USSR covered plant damage and lost shipments. Decades later, funds for former forced laborers, including civilians and prisoners of war, employed in mines, steelworks, and rail depots, were established in Germany, with payouts administered through partner foundations. Eligibility criteria and documentation requirements produced ongoing debates about coverage. Production trajectories diverged after 1945. In the Ruhr and Upper Silesia, coal and steel surged in the late 1940s and early 1950s, then plateaued as oil, electricity, and new process routes altered energy and metal balances. In France and Belgium, mechanization increased face yields and continuous casting reduced reheating, but mine closures accelerated from the late 1950s. Social programs addressed housing and retraining in company towns, whose identities had centered on pits and mills. In the USSR, Donbas and the Dnipro Arc reached and exceeded pre-war baselines under the 4th and 5th plans, though quality and safety indicators remained uneven across districts. Rail modernization proceeded with dieselization and electrification on heavy corridors. Marshalling yards rebuilt under emergency rules became testbeds for hump yard automation. Memory politics took different forms, but used the same sites. In Pas-de-Calais and Liège, plaques mark the strikes of May-June 1941, and memorials list deported miners. Museums document plant practice and day-to-day life in settlements built around shafts and furnaces. In Silesia and the Donbas Basin, memorials record evacuations, front crossings in January to March 1945, and the return to production under new management. In Donbas, monuments commemorate restoration brigades and power and rail crews who worked through 1943 to 1945. Company towns thus serve both as industrial landscapes and as archives of ration queues, identity checks, and shift bells. Narratives vary. Some emphasize resistance and sabotage that targeted yards and substations. Others reconstruct the routines that kept pits and mills operating under quotas and guards. Still others focus on evacuation and reconstruction as phases of one technical process governed by pumping rates, refractory relines, and bridge tonnage limits. Historiography frames the occupation economy through comparative metrics rather than single explanations. One line of analysis maps coercion to output, correlating labor transfers in 1942 to 1943 with changes in coal lifts per face and heats per furnace, and testing whether mixed crews and extended coking times held targets. Another examines transport as the binding constraint, charting the spring 1944 shift, when bombing of yards and bridges reduced wagon turns below levels required by furnace and battery schedules. A third studies institutional carryover, showing how wartime sectional timetables, node defense, and comparative tables became peacetime tools for planning and audit. Debate persists over the relative weight of coercion, management, and transport in explaining regional curves. Northern France and Belgium, with recoveries and sharp drops in 1944. Upper Silesia, with sustained delivery deep into 1944. Occupied Soviet districts with limited output under German rule and stage reconstruction after recapture. From the perspective of those who worked and administered these systems, the legacy is a ledger of constraints and adaptations. Workers recall shift structures tied to ration brackets and lamp room records that continued in altered form after 1945. Plant directors remember the sequence by which a complex returns to life: power to compressors and pumps, dewatering, ventilation, coking, hot metal, rolling, and the rail paths that connect them. Railwaymen describe bridges by tonnage class, boiler days to washout, and the conversion from manual block to automatic signaling under Reconstruction funds. Policymakers read the same period as a case study in how industrial nodes behave under armed governance and how those nodes can be reintegrated into civilian economies. The result is a double inheritance. Company towns at Gunpoint demonstrated that coal, steel, and rail can be driven by quotas enforced through documents, guards, and priority codes. Yet they also revealed the dependence of targets on spares, electricity, and bridges that no decree can conjure. Post-war systems embedded lessons from both sides. Stronger planning ministries and standardized safety on the one hand. Cross-border institutions like the European coal and steel community on the other, designed to bind the very resources that had been contested. The record, traced in monthly tables and yard diagrams from 1939 to 1945 and in Reconstruction reports after, remains a technical narrative of how industrial societies allocate labor, manage risk at nodes, and convert emergency arithmetic into long-term institutions.